All right, this is the one. This video is really interesting and it's trending. So I was kind of curious when the first time I saw it. Saw the title of this. I was like, this is like up my alley because I love history stuff, and sometimes history is always written by the winner. That's what it is. It just it's not always good. So I'm just kind of curious what the interpretation of this is, because I can see where they're coming from. Because the Philippines is sort of like colonized, but it's not at the same time. But there's a lot of military. There's a big military base all over the Philippines, controlled by the U.S. So technically, they are. So I'm just kind of curious where they're taking this point of view is. All right, how the U.S. stole the Philippines by Johnny Harris. Never heard of Johnny Harris, but let's see.
There is a cluster of 7,000 islands that looks like one of the most beautiful places on Earth.
It's really pretty.
People have been living here for over 30,000 years, traveling between these islands, trading with each other and with the region, and developing religion, identity, and culture. It eventually became a country called Mai. And while all of these advancements were happening here on these islands, another group of humans had been evolving in another part of the world, over here in Europe.
Spain.
But this other group had a different culture, a different religion. Many of their advancements were achieved through expansion, not collaboration. And their religion thrived when they stomped out others.
Unfortunately, that's like everywhere.
These islands, these people, this culture would soon be swallowed, stripped of what made them them. And soon their name would be changed, after the name of the king of their conquerors.
Yeah, King Philip.
This isn't a story just about a big, powerful military taking over new lands. We know that story pretty well. The story of these...
Well, Spain, yeah, there's a big impact. I mean, there's basically a huge impact of Spain in the Philippines, right? And if you really actually even look at their feature characteristic, a lot of people say some Filipino tend to look closer to their Spanish side than their southeastern side, which is that's how it is. If you go to a different part of the world, they do the same thing. This is wherever the big influences on that. So that's why a lot of people. They even have that really weird thing that's saying like, I think I was watching a video say, is the Filipino Asian? I said that's the dumbest question. They are Asian because they're in Asia, but they're talking about like the Asian features and stuff like that. Because they don't. Some really look more like European, especially in the Spanish or Latin side. But or Spanish side because they've been conquered through that way.
These people offers a new perspective to anyone who will listen. It's a perspective that has been wiped from our history books because of the inherent discomfort and tension with this fact that the United States, once a colony that heroically threw off an empire to become independent, soon became an empire itself.
True.
It contradicts our founding belief that it is, quote, self-evident that all men are created equal. And this story isn't just history. That empire still exists today, with colonial possessions and subjects. It's all wrapped up in the story of these 7,000 islands and their people. So, I want to tell you the story of how the U.S. stole the Philippines.
There are still American citizens today who do not have equal voting rights. These are citizens of America's island territories.
but the thing is, some do not want to.
On U.S. soil, except in one jurisdiction.
That's really curious. I'm thinking that's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool idea. Because because I was thinking about Puerto Rico, right? Because they're a commonwealth, I guess, of the U.S. Technically, they can do, have some voting and stuff like that, but they really do not. They like, in general, they like what they have right now. They don't want to be the 52nd, state or whatever, because they think they're different and more separated, which is fine. Like, I think it's really up to the people at Puerto Rico if they want to be considered a U.S. Well, technically they can be considered a U.S. citizen if they want to. I think. I'm not really sure. I'm just kind of talking out of my butt right now. I need to do a little bit more research before I say something about something incorrectly. But I always believe in what they want. If they want that, then fine. If they don't want that, that's fine also too. I'm more of a laissez-faire kind of person. It's up to the people.
Quick pause,
First ad break.
because I want to tell you about something that is important to me and happens to also be the sponsor of today's video, which is BetterHelp. I'm a big believer in therapy. I've been in therapy for
I totally understand it though. I think I can see where he's going.
For many years, I didn't think therapy was for me. I thought it was for everyone else.
Hey, hello.
And so I sort of avoided it. But when I finally started going
Barbados,
last year, I really started to realize that there was so much that I could be working on day in and day out that could dramatically.
This is really kind of interesting. I'm gonna think like his idea is.
BetterHelp is a platform.
I can almost picture what he's trying to say.
Virtual platform. So you have access not just to the therapists that are in like your town, but to a huge network of like 15,000 therapists.
Yeah.
So you can find the right fit for you. Finding the right therapist is sometimes difficult. And with BetterHelp, you can, for free, switch to a new therapist as many times as you need to.
It was Bianca's day today.
Your therapist is
you have 3 video requests.
You can message them right.
Well, I don't know if I have time to do video requests.
And approachable way to get in on therapy whenever you want. And BetterHelp is available worldwide. Anywhere in the world that you are that has an internet connection, you can get in on counseling. This isn't a crisis line. This is a professional counseling and therapy by like certified professional therapists. Therapy can be expensive, and with BetterHelp,
Swish Wash go to Vietnam.
And they even offer financial aid.
Hot Rock and Swish Wash going to Vietnam. Really that looks kind of cool. What if the black hole replaced the sun? That looks kind of interesting.
Therapy enough. And
I might check into that. Probably won't get a chance to do it today because like I'm gonna have a little shorter stream today.
This video. There's a link in my description. It is betterhelp.com/JohnnyHarris.
With Miss.
Going to that link will get you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp.
This looks pretty interesting. I will keep that in mind.
Let's get back to the video. This video could be called How Spain Stole the Philippines, since Spain was the first nation to conquer and control these islands like 500 years ago. Actually, exactly 500 years ago. And indeed, Spain left a very deep influence on these islands, not least the name itself,
even the people.
Named after King Philip. Spain brought their religion, their language, their culture, which is why the most common last names in the Philippines are like Reyes or Del Rosario, De la Cruz, De los Santos. But the heyday of the Spanish Empire came and went, and by the 1800s, it was kind of crumbling. But it was the arrival of a new superpower that I believe had a bigger imprint, not just on the Philippines, but on the US itself. It established rules and behaviors that we still grapple with today. And that's why this is the story of how the US stole the Philippines. So let's go.
To this day, we can see the traces of the almost 400 years of Spanish rule over the Philippines. But even more striking is the more recent influence of the United States.
Okay, so it's the end of the 1800s. Up until now, US expansion sort of looks like this. It's all happening on this mainland. And at this point, there sort of became a big debate of like, do we keep going? Some people wanted to keep expanding the US outside of this mainland. The president at the time wasn't a big expansion guy, but he was surrounded by people who loved war. specifically this guy. And these people who surrounded the president had their eye on this Spanish colony right off the American coast called Cuba, where the locals were rising up against Spain.
Wow.
Wait a minute.
It's been a while.
It's a video about the Philippines. Why are we talking about Cuba? We're getting there in just a second, okay? So anyway, Cuba. Americans didn't want to go to war with Cuba. They're like, we don't need more war. But thanks to the explosion of an American submarine in Cuba, which was probably an accident, and thanks to some highly unethical journalism that blamed the explosion on Spain, and a big thanks to, again, this guy, Teddy Roosevelt, who at this point was just a peon. He was literally the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But he somehow cajoled his boss's boss, the President of the United States, to go to war in Cuba to, like, liberate the Cubans from Spain. So the U.S.
Okay. Here's a... Teddy was like, I think he's one of the most interesting presidents. The dude is so interesting. If you read his stuff of Teddy Roosevelt, you kind of understand where he is. He's like more of an adventurer, but like he's from a really rich family because he's a Roosevelt and everything else. But he was one of those people like that just really he just has a very adventurous type of heart. He always want to, go out and do adventuring. That's why if you read his story, it's just incredible and crazy at the same time. He just, if he has something like a really crazy idea, he will do it. And he did. His life is incredible. He's one of the, to me, one of the coolest president to read about. You may or may not like some of the stuff he did when he was president, but like his whole life was really interesting. It's just like one of the most interesting read if you want to learn about a president. And I can understand why he, kind of pushed to go to war because he was just that type.
Declared war on Spain in 1898. But this begins a new era of war in the United States. No longer can you just go into war and just like take over land. You need an angle. You need to sell the war to the American people.
True.
So the angle on this war was liberation. We were liberating the people.
The people you liberate.
We use that all the time.
Witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
No. That's later. We're talking about 1898. But yes, the whole idea of
the
selling
same idea.
war to
They
the
still
American
do
public
it.
didn't really go away after this.
Why did the
They
US
still do
go to
it
war
now.
in Iraq?
In the early stages of military operations.
So anyway, the US is now at war with Spain, which is an empire that is deeply in decline, as I mentioned. It's not going to be hard to win. But soon, it's not just Cuba. The US, really meaning Teddy Roosevelt, who again is just an assistant secretary of the Navy. He's like not a big decision maker. He somehow maneuvers the situation.
He's not a big decision maker, but he was like very influential with the name of Roosevelt. That's why he just saying like, how does this guy have so much power? It's just like back then it's still a chrono, it's just like who you know. And with the name of like Roosevelt, come on. He's just kind of not really thinking through on that part.
To say,
I understand where he's coming from, but still.
Puerto Rico. And while we're at it, let's go into the Pacific and liberate Guam and the Philippines from Spain as well. Teddy didn't even ask his boss to do this. He literally sent off a cable to the Navy commander in Asia that was like, George
That's
Dewey,
just saying how weak the president is that he can do
Spain
this.
That is what your mandate is. And George Dewey's like, okay, I'm being told to go to war with Spain and the Philippines. Teddy was sort of the mind like better to ask forgiveness than permission. I mean, I get that, but kind of nuts that he pulled it off. Anyway, and now because of Teddy Roosevelt, who we literally named the teddy bear after.
True.
Side note, we are at war not in the Caribbean only, but also in the Pacific. The US arrives to the Philippines and sees that the locals had already been fighting against the Spanish for like years. The Spanish were weak and were totally declining.
Yeah.
So it's like the top of the ninth inning or like the fourth quarter of the Spanish in the Philippines. And the US shows up and is like, let us liberate you. And the Philippines were like, well, we've sort of already been fighting this bloody war for years against the Spanish. So yeah, I guess United States,
help.
if you want to come help us deal the final blow to Spain, like sweet. So George Dewey, this Navy commander, and his fleet show up to Manila. Meanwhile, back in the US, people are like, wait, weren't we just supposed to invade Cuba? What are we doing in the Philippines now? And the US government's like, because the Philippines is a perfect hub for commercial opportunities in Asia, and we think that if we don't take it, Japan or Germany might take it, which would clearly diminish our geostrategic advantage in the Pacific.
Well, it just have...
No, they didn't say that. They said, we want to liberate the people.
I always say stuff
like
that.
Liberate.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
So the Spanish and the US arrived in the Philippines and they're like, great, we're done. So the Spanish military commanders asked to meet with the US military commanders. They meet in secret, and Spain's like, listen, I know we're losing, but we really want to save some face here. We don't want it to look like we lost to the Filipino revolutionaries. And I'm not kidding, the Spanish commander literally said that he would, quote, be willing to surrender to white people, but not to the Filipinos.
Whoa.
So
well,
the US
that's
commander's
like in the
okay,
1800s.
there's an opportunity here. We said we were here to liberate the Filipinos, but we haven't promised anything yet. So we would much rather it look like the US defeated Spain instead of helped the Filipinos defeat Spain. Much better for our brand, says the United States. So together, the United States and Spanish militaries organize a fake battle. A fake battle in which the US would fight the Spanish in Manila, and the Spanish would intentionally lose. And the climax of this whole theatrical battle, according to the plan, was that at the end, the US would storm towards the inner walled city of Manila, the last stronghold of where the Spanish are. Oh, and the key detail in this whole plan, they would not let the Filipino fighters, the ones that had been doing all of the actual fighting against the Spanish, join them as they stormed towards the walled city to deal the final blows to the Spanish Empire. And this would mean that the Filipinos technically didn't gain their independence. It was actually the US who conquered the Spanish, and then the Spanish were like,
is more like a trade.
$20 million for our troubles, and the US was like, yeah, sure. So
yeah,
now the US
it's more like a
wins
trade.
the war,
it's
and
like
they claim sovereignty over the Philippines.
They just sold it, basically.
So yeah, this happened. They did the fake battle. They won the war.
They were just
Instead
selling
of liberating the Filipinos, they just say, hey, we're your new colonizers. Psych. Meanwhile, back in the United States, they got to keep up this white savior liberation narrative that they created to justify going to war with Spain. So you see a lot more theatrical PR by the government. They staged this giant military parade in New York City, where this military commander who did the fake war, George Dewey, marches down. They called it Dewey Day. It was like a 2-day parade in New York City. They created a big military arch for him. He became like a military hero for having liberated all these people from the Spanish.
It's about
and then
PR.
You start to see these crazy advertisements, like this soap advertisement.
It's propaganda.
That has George Dewey, the commander,
well, I mean,
washing his hands.
He's
with
not
the caption,
wrong. They're using propaganda. This is what propaganda is. In every war, there's propaganda. Or whatever they do, it's just they're trying to make themselves look the better person. And the thing is, you only hear about that part of the story because they're the one that won it. Like I said, the winner can just say whatever they want in history. So that's what it is. Propaganda doesn't. War in general is all about propaganda. You're trying to kind of please the people of your country. That it's just everywhere they do it. They do it the same way. Yeah, nobody likes it. It's just how they do. And the thing is, tons and tons of people fall for it all the time. People still fall for it right now. If you're talking about, just listen to the media right now, it's just, yeah. They go into places where I think, you shouldn't, because, the politics part right now about the U.S. and Afghanistan. You can take it wherever way it is. You can say, oh, we left because and we just kind of left it, and it's our fault for how it is. But Afghanistan has been there forever, and they have issues over there forever. So yeah, exactly. So nobody really knows the situation except for the people that's there.
quote, the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And on the sides, you have soap being offloaded in the Philippines and being given to the locals. The US had to frame this not as conquest, but as the honorable duty of the US to civilize these people, or in the words of the soap ad, quote, to brighten the dark corners of the earth. Jeez.
Hey, Annie.
This is
what are you
insane
doing?
And was not that long ago. Okay, so this is where things really heat up. It's 1900 now. Spain loses the war, obviously, and the U.S.
Save your money,
now
Annie.
owns Puerto Rico,
But thank you, though.
Guam, and they claim the Philippines. But the local Filipinos who have been fighting for their freedom for years are like, no, 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 no. You just waltzed in here on our rebellion and conspired with the Spanish to make it look like you were liberating us. No, this is our country. We don't need another colonizer. And this is where things really heat up. The Filipinos start fighting again for their independence, and this time against the United States. It is a pretty horrible, bloody war, one that I never learned about in school. It includes massacres of men, women, and children by the United States, and hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. But the US eventually won, and they established a government in the Philippines. Back in the US, the appetite for expansion continued to go down, and people sort of just forgot about the Philippines. They forgot that there was a war there. One newspaper summed it up by saying, Americans didn't know if the Philippines were islands or canned fruit. But the fact remained that the US
Well,
went
that's
to
also
war
back then,
and
too.
now owned the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam. So this begged a very important question, one that hadn't been asked before, which is all of this land America? Are these people Americans? This was a huge question. And
That's
the
a good
answer to
question.
that question affects how we see these territories still today. Okay, so a few years after
It's what
these
the people
wars,
think there,
there's a
to be
guy in New
honest with
York
you.
City who's importing oranges from one of these territories, Puerto Rico. And he's paying tariffs on these imports because, you know, that's what you do when you're importing oranges from another country. Wait a minute, another country? This guy was like, didn't we conquer Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines? Isn't that America? The Constitution says that you can't put tariffs on stuff coming from other parts of the US. Like New Jersey can't put tariffs
that's
on
pretty
like
quick.
avocados from California. So he sued, and his case and a bunch of others like it made it to the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court must decide, is this land where we just won a war, is this America? Are these Americans? If they are, do they get all the same rights as other Americans? Do they get to vote? Do they get to participate in the US economy without tariffs, like any other state does? And honestly, this isn't a question about oranges and tariffs. The real question at stake here is America the land of the free where all are created equal, or are we an empire? No different than any other empire that scoops up colonial possessions in war and rules the people, who are usually black and brown, as subjects, not fully a part of the country. That was the question that was asked.
That's a little bit dividing.
In the early 1900s, the Supreme
it seems like he did some research and stuff of that. The only thing is the way he he expressed it. It's just like very I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have gone that extreme where he's sort of kind of jabbing a little bit, like you know. I understand his feeling, but sometimes like with these type of like you know, trying to give somebody your opinion, this is supposed to be more of a telling you more of a history, but it's hidden in a commentary also too. It's almost this little commentary, but he sort of kind of wrapped it into like this little documentary kind of thing. So it's just, you know, I just want the information. You know, I want to learn about it. I don't want your personal opinion about it. I'd rather myself understand the situation and form my opinion about it. He's interjecting some of his opinion in it by the way he Yeah, I want you to be objective. Yeah, when I want to watch like these type of stuff, I want it to be just give me information. I don't want your to know your personal opinion about it, but it seems to be a lot of people are interjecting their opinion to it. This is why I don't really like watching the news and stuff like that, because like everybody have their own opinion jam into it. All I want to know is give me the information, let me look at it so I can decide. You know? It's just it's good. It's a good video, but like every time I hear I know where he's interjecting. I know where is his opinion about the situation is. The story itself is fine. The story itself is really interesting, but it does not have to have his personal opinion in it. But it's YouTube. Everybody has their own opinion on it too. So I guess I can see where he's trying to do, paint his own personal view on it, but I don't know. I don't like it.
Court decided that America
But it's a good video, though.
Was the latter.
It's a very good video.
Is the latter. They created a new category of land called unincorporated territories, where the people don't have any representation in the democracy, but where Congress could create laws on their own, particularly laws dealing with revenue, which would not be allowed by the Constitution for states within the Union. We can create revenue laws, stuff that's totally unconstitutional for other parts of our country. In other words, unincorporated territories are land we control and exploit for revenue, but whose people don't get to vote and don't get the right to trial by jury. So yeah, the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam, remained unincorporated territories, a place that the US could kind of just ignore without a lot of consequence. They weren't important enough or strategic enough to be considered to become states like Hawaii or Alaska. So they sort of...
Hold up. This is where I disagree with them. Because like for a while, like there's a certain type... here's my understanding of Puerto Rico in general too. Puerto Rico can always, where they can really, if they want to, they can apply for statehood. But they need like a majority of people. They need to be voted on. But like when they're voting on, I think the most recent, like when they were asking for it, it was really, really close. But they have to be, they have to be agreed upon. And so this is where I kind of disagree with him on that part, where they don't have that type of right. It's like really determined by the people that live there if that's what they want to do. I don't know about the Philippines or Guam, or I know Guam is is a big military base there too, but they do have a lot of the advantage, rights as as a state, but they also have the the stuff that they don't have to do as a state also too. So this is very... It's not this black and white. It's not this black and white. He just sort of paints this really black and white situation, right or wrong or whatever. Whatever your opinion is, you can go for that. But like, this is where his interjection is in there too, also too, which I don't have a problem with it. It's just, he's just, there's no clear, he just,
faded from American consciousness. Like, this is why we never heard about this in school. Like, it didn't make it into the history books in any salient way. And how far the Philippines had faded from people's minds became very clear in December of 1941. During World War II. The US had owned the Philippines for like 40 years, when a fleet of Japanese bombers flew across the Pacific and bombed an American naval base in Hawaii.
Severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
But what we don't really remember is on that day, Japan bombed Guam and the Philippines, 2 American territories, as well as several other American and British territories.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Here's the draft of this speech. This is the original draft that FDR spent the day marking up before he gave it. Zoom in a little bit and you'll see on this draft that it mentioned the Philippines originally, but FDR crossed it out. He crossed out the mention of Manila. Yes, the Philippines was on some map somewhere. Yes, we technically owned it. But the people really didn't want to hear about it because these people weren't Americans. The Supreme Court had decided that. They weren't going to become states anytime soon.
That's just like, it's a speech. You know, it's a speech. The people mark it off. That just kind of proved the point of what he said was incorrect. He was saying like he was trying to prove that, saying like they don't even recognize the Philippines as like part of the U.S. But you can see in the speech it was there. He just didn't. He just marked it off on a speech. So his logic is, you can break that apart either way. You can say like, well, I mean, it was in the original like part of the draft, so they, it's important enough to be in a draft. If the Philippines wasn't important enough in the draft, it wouldn't have been in there at all. So that kind of proves the point of him saying like, that we didn't care about the Philippines. That makes no sense either. Because he didn't say it, but it's in the draft too. So it was in their mind.
So why mention them? After that day, Japan actually full-on invaded the Philippines. They didn't do that to Hawaii, but they did to the Philippines.
Because Hawaii was so far away.
At which point, the Philippines was closer. Granted independence in 1946. Fast forward to today, and this "we own you, but you're not really Americans" precedent established by the Supreme Court still applies to 4 million people who live in unincorporated territories. Or let's just call it a spade a spade. Let's call them what they are. These are colonial possessions. The people who live here don't experience the full rule of law. They don't get trial by jury. They don't have full representation in our democracy. And they don't get to vote for the president. This is why when a hurricane hits Puerto Rico,
do they want
the
to or
government
not?
response is not nearly what it should be. The way Trump talked about Puerto Rico as almost another country, as not a part of us, mirrors exactly how the Supreme Court talked about these unincorporated territories. They're for revenue, not to compete with American farmers. We conquered these places, but we didn't want to bring the people fully into the American project. We left them out, and there they remain today.
Here's my part of this. It's like, I do understand where he's coming from, and I do agree with it at a part. But also, too, I'm thinking, like, you have to understand the people there. Do the people there want to be considered American? A lot of the people indigenous to those countries do not. Because they think, they're their own country. They don't think that way. You just can't assume that everybody want to be, part of the U.S. state. That's why the Puerto Rico has always been on the docket about becoming the state, and it's getting closer and closer. The reason why is just like there's a lot of people that they feel like their own country. That's why they don't want to vote on that. I think it's the same thing with the Philippines and Guam, because like you can also take it the different way, where you can say like we didn't impose them to be the part of the U.S. right away. Exactly, they do not want to owned by the U.S. And the thing like that too. So I don't know. I like the video. I understand what he's trying to say about the Philippines and and stuff like that, which I did not know enough about. But I still think there's like a lot of part he kind of left out. He's sort of sharing his view, which is fine. It's a great video. There's a lot of parts I don't agree with. Very nice video. I can see why it's trending.